My name is Nadia Osei, and I am 31 years old. My grandmother died on a Thursday in November, and by Sunday her house was already being measured for renovations. Not by contractors. By my uncle. I remember standing in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 43 years, watching Victor walk the perimeter of the living room with a tape measure and a yellow legal pad, and thinking, she has been gone for 72 hours. Her reading glasses are still on the side table. And you are measuring the walls. Nobody asked me to be there. I had driven 4 hours because she was my grandmother, and I loved her, and I thought that was reason enough. I did not yet understand that in my family, love has never been reason enough for anything. Everything runs on paperwork. On who is in the room when the paperwork is signed. On who gets to decide, very quietly, that certain people were never supposed to know what the paperwork said. What they told me at the funeral, very gently, very sadly, was that Grandma Osei had left everything to the family trust. That Victor, as the eldest son and the one who had managed her affairs for 20 years, would continue managing the trust. That the house, the investments, and the company, a mid-size import business my grandfather had built from scratch and my grandmother had quietly grown for 4 decades after he died, would remain under the trust. Under Victor. They told me she had left me her jewelry and her Bible. I thanked them. I drove 4 hours home. I sat in my apartment and I looked at the Bible she had given me, and I noticed something. There was a key taped to the inside back cover. Small. Bronze. A number stamped on the side. I did not sleep that night. Before I tell you what that key opened and what I found inside, take a second and tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments, I read everyone. And hit subscribe before we keep going, because what my grandmother had been quietly building for 20 years is the part of the story that changes everything. Now let me take you back to who she was. Because you need to understand her before you can understand what she did. Esther Osei was 78 years old when she died. She had come to this country at 22 with my grandfather, $40, and a specific and unshakable belief that the people who showed up early and worked quietly and kept their records in order would eventually outlast everyone who relied on noise. She used to say that to me when I was small. She would say, Nadia, the loudest person in the room is never the one who built it. I did not fully understand what she meant until I was standing in a bank manager's office on a Tuesday morning in December looking at the contents of a safety deposit box that my entire family had believed did not exist. My grandmother had been a quiet woman in the way that certain women are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned, precisely and through long experience, that the people around them are not yet ready to hear it. She ran the company's books herself until her 70s. She remembered every vendor, every contract cycle, every outstanding receivable. Victor managed the client relationships and the public face of the business. My grandmother managed the truth of it. She knew things about Victor that Victor did not know she knew. She had known them for years. Victor was 61. He had managed the family import business, Osei Trading, my grandfather's name on the door, for 22 years. He had a way of speaking about the company that made it sound like his idea. Like he had built it. Like his father and his mother had simply provided the initial materials and then stepped aside to let him create something. At every family dinner, every holiday, every company anniversary event, Victor talked about the business the way a man talks about a child he raised alone, with a possessiveness so deep it had started to look like love. My grandmother sat at those dinners and ate her food and did not correct him. I used to think that was patience. I understand now it was something more strategic than patience. It was rope. She was giving him rope for years, waiting for the moment when what she knew would become what she could prove. And then she spent the last 5 years of her life making sure that moment would survive her. The key opened a safety deposit box at a bank branch 20 minutes from the house she had lived in for 43 years. Not the bank the family used. A different one. A small regional branch where the manager knew her by name and had known her for 11 years and had witnessed, along with 2 other staff members, the document she had placed in that box in 3 separate visits, each one notarized, each one dated, each one airtight. Inside the box was a will. Not the will Victor had filed with the family attorney. A second will, executed 14 months before the first one and superseding it under the state's laws on testamentary documents. A will my grandmother had prepared with her own attorney, not the family's attorney, her own. A woman named Constance Abra who had an office downtown and had represented my grandmother personally and privately for 11 years without anyone in my family knowing she existed. I sat in the bank manager's office and I read it. She left me the house. She left me 42% of Osei Trading, enough, combined with the 11% she had already transferred to me over the preceding 5 years in annual gift tax-exempt increments that I had never known about, to give me 53%. Majority ownership. She left me a letter that I will not read to you here because it belongs to me, but I will tell you this. She had known for years what Victor was doing with the company's money. She had documentation. She had kept it. And she had left it in the box along with everything else, organized by year, annotated in her handwriting, precise and thorough and absolutely devastating. I closed the box. I thanked the bank manager. I drove home. And I did not tell anyone what I had found. I want to explain what that silence cost me. Because people hear stories like this, and they imagine the planning phase as clean and powerful. A woman who knows she has won, moving the pieces with cold confidence. That is not what it felt like. What it felt like was sitting with a secret so large it had physical weight, at Christmas dinner with my mother and my uncle and my cousins. Watching Victor talk about the company's next fiscal year with the authority of a man who believed completely that everything he was describing was his. Watching my mother nod along. Watching my cousins take notes on their phones. And knowing, sitting very still and eating my food the way my grandmother used to eat hers, that none of what they were planning was going to happen the way they thought. I called Constance Abra the Monday after I found the box. She had been expecting my call. She told me my grandmother had instructed her to wait for me to make contact and not to reach out first, because she had wanted to make sure I found the key myself, which would mean I had found the Bible, which would mean I had read it closely, which would mean I was the kind of person who paid attention to small things in difficult moments. She said my grandmother had told her, if Nadia finds the key, she's ready. If she doesn't, give her time. I had found the key in the first 48 hours. Constance walked me through everything over 3 meetings in December. The will, the ownership transfer history, the documentation my grandmother had assembled on Victor's financial activity. What I learned across those 3 meetings made the tape measure moment look gentle. Victor had been paying himself an undisclosed management fee from the company's operating accounts for 9 years, a fee no board had approved because there was no board. Just Victor and the family attorney who had been billing the trust for advice that consistently benefited Victor. He had made 2 significant real estate purchases using company funds that had been classified in the books as vendor payments. He had been, in the precise legal language Constance used, systematically misappropriating assets from a trust he had been appointed to protect. My grandmother had known since year 3. She had said nothing. She had documented everything. Constance looked at me across her desk and said, "Your grandmother did not leave you an inheritance. She left you a case." I asked her what I needed to do. She said, "Show up to the annual board meeting in February. That's when Victor presents the company financials to the family. Let him present. And then we'll talk." I said I could do that. What I did not say, what I was only beginning to understand in those December meetings, was that I was not just executing my grandmother's plan. I had become, sitting in that office with Constance's files spread across the table, something I had never been in my family before. I was the person who knew. And knowing I was learning was not the same as having power. Knowing was the beginning of having power. What came next was the work of making what I knew impossible to deny in a room full of people who had spent my entire life deciding I was not worth paying attention to. That was the work of January. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you are watching this and you have a grandmother, or an aunt, or any older woman in your family who is quiet in the specific way I have been describing, who eats her food at family dinners and does not correct the loudest person in the room, I want you to pay attention to her. Not because she is necessarily building something the way my grandmother was, but because quiet women who have been watching for a long time usually know things. And they're usually waiting to see if you are the kind of person they can trust with what they know. Drop a comment and tell me, has anyone in your family ever surprised you with something they had been quietly holding on to? I read every single one. And hit subscribe if you want to know what happened in February, because the board meeting is the part everyone asks me about. Now back to January. January was the month I became someone I did not entirely recognize. I went back to work. I was a financial analyst, which turned out to be the detail my grandmother had perhaps been counting on more than any other. I understood the documents she had left me. I understood what the numbers meant and which ones were wrong and how to explain the wrongness to people who needed to see it clearly. I spent evenings going through 22 years of company financials that Constance had obtained through the proper legal channels once the will had been validated and my ownership position had been formally established. The pattern was not subtle. It had been subtle once, in the first years. By year 7 it had stopped being subtle and had simply become the way things were done, because there had never been anyone with both the knowledge and the standing to stop it. I now had both. I organized everything into a presentation. Not an accusation, a presentation. Structured the way I would structure anything at work. Findings. Supporting data. Timeline. Implications. I had Constance review every slide. She changed 3 words and told me the rest was ready. The annual family board meeting was scheduled for the first Saturday in February. Victor hosted it every year at the company's main office, a ritual he had established as both a business review and a family gathering, because combining them made the business review harder to scrutinize. People were eating catering and catching up with cousins. The financial slides went by fast. This year I asked Constance to be present. She came as my legal representative, which I was entitled to bring under the company's own articles of association, articles Victor had written and therefore had never imagined might be used against him. Victor did not know about the will. None of them did. Constance had advised me to let the validation process complete quietly, which it had, before any family notification was required. The notification would come at the meeting. And then, 10 days before the meeting, my mother called me. She had heard something. Not specifics, just enough. A cousin had mentioned seeing me at a law office downtown. My mother's voice on the phone was the voice she uses when she is trying to decide how worried to be. She asked me, very casually, if everything was okay. I told her everything was fine. She said Victor was planning something special for the February meeting. A restructuring proposal. He was going to recommend that the family formalize his role as permanent CEO with an expanded compensation package and reduced trust oversight. I said that was interesting. She said, Nadia, if you have something going on, it would be better to talk to Victor first. He's been managing this family's assets for 20 years. He knows things you don't. I said, I know, Mom. I'll see you at the meeting. I hung up and I sat with that sentence for a long time. He knows things you don't. 24 hours earlier, I had finished annotating the last of 22 years of financial records that told the story of exactly what Victor knew and exactly what he had done with that knowledge. I added my mother's phone call to my notes. Then I went back to the presentation. The meeting was on a Saturday morning. The company's main conference room. 12 family members seated around a long table, catering on a side table, Victor at the head with his laptop connected to the projector. He presented for 40 minutes. The company's performance. The growth trajectory. His vision for the next 5 years. The restructuring proposal, framed as a natural evolution, an opportunity to professionalize the family's governance. He used the word legacy 4 times. He talked about my grandfather. He talked about everything my grandfather had built and everything he, Victor, had continued to build in his name. My grandmother's name he mentioned once. When he finished, he asked if there were any questions before the family voted on the restructuring proposal. I raised my hand. Victor looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has just noticed something unexpected in a room he believed he fully controlled. He said, Nadia. Not a greeting. An assessment. I said I had a few things I wanted to share before the vote. I said I had asked Constance to join us, and Constance, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, opened the folder in front of her. I stood up. I connected my own laptop to the projector. I pulled up the first slide. I did not raise my voice. I had thought about raising my voice many times over the previous 3 months, and I had always arrived at the same conclusion. My grandmother had never raised hers. There was something in that worth honoring. I told them about the will. I showed them the validation documents. I showed them the ownership structure, the 42% my grandmother had left me, the 11% she had been gifting me annually for 5 years, the 53% total that made me the majority owner of Osei Trading effective the date of her death. The room was very quiet. Victor said, that's not possible. I moved to the next slide. I showed them 9 years of undisclosed management fees. The real estate transactions classified as vendor payments. The pattern, year by year, documented in the handwriting of a woman who had sat at family dinners for 22 years and eaten her food and said nothing and written everything down. My mother said my name. I don't know what she meant by it. It was the kind of moment where a name is said because there are no words and something has to fill the silence. Victor looked at Constance. He said, this will be contested. Constance said, it's already been validated by the probate court. We completed that process in January. Victor looked at me. And I watched something happen in his face that I had watched happen in faces before, in smaller moments, smaller rooms, but never quite like this. The particular recalibration of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. That someone had known, for a very long time, exactly where the fault lines were. He said, your grandmother would not have wanted this. I said, she built it. So I'm going to trust that she knew exactly what she wanted. The restructuring proposal was not voted on that Saturday. Several things happened in the weeks that followed that I will not detail fully here because some of them are still being resolved in ways that require discretion. What I will tell you is that Victor is no longer managing Osei Trading. What I will tell you is that Constance filed a civil recovery action that resulted in a settlement I am not at liberty to specify, but that my grandmother's documentation made very difficult to contest. What I will tell you is that the company, my grandfather's name on the door, is being run for the first time by someone with his blood and her strategy. Me. I moved into my grandmother's house in March. I kept her reading glasses on the side table. I kept her Bible on the shelf above my desk, the key tucked back into the inside cover where she had left it, because I want to remember what it felt like to find it. What it felt like to hold a small bronze key and understand, slowly, in the dark of a November night, that someone who loved you had spent years building something for the specific moment when you would be ready to receive it. I am 31 years old. I run a company. I have an attorney I trust and a grandmother I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of. She did not leave me nothing. She left me everything. She just needed me to find it myself. If you watched this entire story and felt something, if you recognized something in the quiet woman at the table who kept her records and said nothing and waited, I want you to hear this. The people who build things quietly are not passive. They are not absent. They are not resigned. They are playing a longer game than the people around them can see. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they are building something specifically for you. And they're watching to see if you're the kind of person who pays attention to small things. Who reads the Bible closely. Who finds the key. Pay attention to the quiet ones. Leave a comment and tell me, has someone in your life ever done something for you that you only understood long after they were gone? I want to hear it. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you, subscribe to this channel. Every week there is another story like this one. Women who were underestimated. Women who inherited something nobody expected. Women who walked into rooms full of people who had decided they didn't matter and changed everything without raising their voice. My grandmother never raised hers. And she won. Subscribe. I'll see you next week.